So we've got a really good talk now this afternoon by one of our own members, Greg Nuttgens, who will be telling us how long he's been keeping bees and what's it all about. He's Education Secretary for Bridgend Beekeeping Association. Is that right? So he obviously knows his stuff backwards. So if we can give him a big round of applause, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for coming. Can you all hear me at the back? Good, sounds loud enough to me. First of all, an apology. I did say in the publicity for this that I'd be bringing live bees in an observation hive, but unfortunately this weather would make it impossible. They would probably die being kept in a sort of glass case for a couple of hours. So I decided to abandon that idea. If anybody really wants to see live bees, then if you come and have a chat with me afterwards, it might be possible to arrange for a visit to an apiary to look at bees. So, if you're really keen, you can come and have a look. Right, well, a little bit about myself. I've lived in Porthcawl for nearly 20 years now. I've done various jobs. My last job was with the Welsh Assembly government. I started keeping bees just before I retired, which is about 12 years ago now. So I've been keeping bees for 12 years or so. I've got 12 hives now. I did have more, but I've cut down a bit. And I'm going to explain a little bit about bees and basically why I keep bees. When we first came down, we bought a flat in Ocean View. I don't know if you know Ocean View along the front, which has no garden. But I wanted somewhere where I could keep bees and grow vegetables and so on. So I was fortunate to get a lease on the walled garden at Tithixton. Belongs to Tithixton Estate. And it's an 18th century walled garden. The wall is intact. There isn't much else there from the old walled garden, but it makes a very good place to keep bees and to grow vegetables. So I started keeping bees in the walled garden, I'd say about 12 years or so ago. Right, now a little bit of background about bees. Some of you may know about bees, some of you may not. Well, one of the things you hear quite often about bees is that something like 30% of our food would not exist without bees. So that includes not just honeybees, but bumblebees and all other kinds of bees. And here is a slide showing some of the foods that depend on pollination by bees. Some of them are fairly obvious, like the fruits. These are directly pollinated by bees. In fact, in America and other places where they grow these on commercial scale, they import hives of bees in order to do the pollination. Some of them may be a little less obvious, like cauliflowers and sunflower seeds, I think that is. But although they don't directly give rise to the vegetable, we need to grow seed. And anything that requires seed to be grown has to be originally pollinated by bees. So one way or another, there's a very large range of plants which are dependent on bees. And pollination can be by bumblebees or honeybees and other insects as well. Wild pollinators in many parts of the world are declining for various reasons. So a big advantage of honeybees is the numbers. You can get up to 50,000 bees in a single hive. So you imagine you've got an orchard full of almonds or peaches or whatever. You've got an awful lot of bees. Hang on, it's gone off. It's all right, okay. Right, what is a honeybee? I don't know how well you can see this. There's a rather lot of light coming in. Does anybody know which of those is a honeybee? Top left? Bottom left? No. Bottom left is a bumblebee. Okay. Bottom right is a honeybee. A lot of people get muddled with different types of insects. I get a lot of calls, excuse me, through the association from people who've got bees in their garden or bees in their shed or bees in their roof. And very often they're not bees at all. They could even be the top left, which is actually a fly. It's not a bee at all. It's a hoverfly. But they mimic themselves to look like wasps because that gives them a bit of protection, because wasps are nasty things that sting. These don't have a sting, but they mimic themselves. Top right is a wasp, of course, yellow and black. Bottom left is a bumblebee. The majority of calls we get about bees are bumblebees, and they're often living in the eaves of your house or in a nest box or something in the garden. And most people say, they ring up, can you come and destroy these insects? And that, unfortunately, is a reaction of a lot of people. And I have to say to them, well, look, if they're bumblebees, just ignore them. They won't sting you. They'll disappear at the end of the summer. The queens go into hibernation and they won't bother you at all. And fortunately, most people do. Some people still insist on having them destroyed, unfortunately. Honeybees, if they get into your house, can be a bit more of a problem. If they're well established in a wall cavity and they're causing a nuisance and they're stinging people and so on, then sometimes we do have to destroy them, or at least we get commercial companies to destroy them. But again, if you are faced with this situation, don't just get anybody. If you ring up the association, they'll recommend a couple of people who do the job properly. Okay. Yes, a little bit more about bees as an animal. They are, of course, insects. They belong to a large group of insects called Hymenoptera. Those are insects with 2 pairs of wings. The flies only have 1 pair of wings. All those others have 2 pairs of wings. And the bumblebee and the honeybee are in the same group called Apidea. But there's only 1 species of true honeybee in Britain, and that is what we call Apis mellifera, which is the honeybee. In the wild, honeybees make nests in cavities in trees. This is a wall cavity where I took the part of the wall down to try and remove it, and you can see they make these beautiful combs. See the vertical combs. Bees do all that themselves, and they could fill quite a large cavity like this. But what beekeepers do is that they introduce them into a hive. They're still wild animals. There are still plenty of wild colonies about. There's one in Tithixton Manor, for example, which has been there for years, still surviving. But anyway, we put them into a hive. So what is a hive? Well, many people think of that, which is it's called a skep, S-K-E-P, made of straw. And this is how people used to keep bees up until the 19th century. It was a rather primitive way of keeping bees because basically to get the honey out, you had to destroy the bees. They scraped all the comb out and usually killed the bees with smoke or fire or something and then extracted the honey. So not very efficient, but it looks nice. And then some of you may think of that as being a beehive, with that typical beehive shape. It's known as a WBC hive, which is named after a Victorian vicar called William Brufton Carr, WBC. And he designed one of the earliest, what we call movable frame hives. Nowadays, we use these rather not such attractive things, and these are national hives, which are simpler, more versatile than the WBC. They're all based on the idea of frames. Rather than the bees making frames, we make a frame for them, and we put a piece of what we call foundation, which is simply a sheet of wax impregnated with the honeycomb pattern, and the bees build out on that to make their comb. You can come and look at these afterwards. I've got a comb here which has been drawn out by the bees. You can see It's been drawn out sort of 0.5 centimetre each side. So it saves the bees a lot of work and effort. A little bit about hives. Again, you can come and look at this afterwards. But the basic hive is made up of 2 parts. There's this bottom box, which is called a brood box, and in there the queen lays all the eggs, and the worker bees look after the young developing bees. On top of that, we have a screen called a queen excluder, and this allows the worker bees to come through, but not the queen. So we put that on there, and we put a sort of honey box on top called a super, and in there the bees store the honey. So the queen cannot get through, otherwise she'd start filling this full of eggs as well. So when we took the honey away, we'd be taking the young bees away as well. And in here, again, you can look at this afterwards, this is a frame full of honey. I took it out of the hive this morning. Some of it has been capped with wax. When it's ready to store, the bees store this during the winter, they cap it with wax. Okay, and you can put your finger in there and eat it. Very nice. So that's a little bit about hives. And there's a honey frame that's completely sealed. To extract the honey, we cut that wax capping off and we put it into a circular drum, which is like a centrifuge. So you spin it round and the centrifugal force pulls the honey out, and then we can put it into jars. So a little bit about bees themselves. A colony of bees consists of a queen, and there's only one per colony. She's a fertile female, and her job is basically to lay eggs. She'll lay up to 1,500 eggs a day. She may lay 1 million eggs in her lifetime. So that's all she does, is lays eggs. Worker bees, they're there all the year round. They're the majority of the bees in the hive. In the middle of summer, there might be 50,000 bees, worker bees, in a hive. And then you get the drones, which are the males. These are unfertilized eggs, so they are male. They only appear sort of spring and summer, and at the end of the summer they either die or the workers chuck them out because they have only one function, which is to mate. And once they've done that, the workers get rid of them. Very sad. There's a queen. You can see she's got a long body, fairly short wings in relation to her body. She can fly, but she'll normally only fly twice maybe in her life. When the bees swarm, and I'll come to swarming later on, and also when she flies off to mate. By the way, if anybody's got any questions, you can ask afterwards, or if there's something you don't understand, stick your hand up while I'm talking. We can try and answer them. So all round the queen is a little group of workers. They often sort of congregate round the queen and they feed her as well. So they're constantly working with the queen. And she's got a long abdomen which she pushes down into each cell and lays an egg. You perhaps can't see that, but in the bottom of each of these cells is a tiny little, like a little grain of rice, and that's an egg. So that frame is completely covered with eggs, which will develop into a grub and eventually into a bee. That's a worker bee. Again, you can't see it very well. Those are the ones that do all the work. In the summer, they last about 6 weeks. They work very hard. They're out foraging for water and nectar and pollen and so on. But towards the end of the summer, they change slightly, and we get what we call the winter bees, the same type of bee, but they will live up to 6 months from, say, end of November through to March. And they form a small cluster in the middle of the hive. A lot of the summer bees die off, so you may only have about 5,000 bees in the cluster in the winter, but they will live right through the winter, feeding on the honey that they have stored. And that's a drone. A big fat bee. It's got very large eyes compared with the others. One of the reasons for the large eyes is that when the queen flies off to mate, the drones follow her in a big group, and they're competing to try and mate with the queen, so they need good eyesight to try and track her. And the queen will mate up with up to 15 different drones. And so she has sperm from maybe 15 different drones. So when she lays the eggs, the genetics of each one could be slightly different. So they're not all exactly the same. A bit about swarming. Well, you may have or may not have seen a swarm. It's quite a scary thing. The sky is full of bees buzzing everywhere. Then eventually they form a sort of ball or a cluster, usually on a branch or on a wall. What that is it's their natural way of reproducing. When the hive gets a bit too full, or if conditions are not very good, the queen leaves the hive with about half of the bees, so maybe 20,000 bees. They all fly off and they try and find another site, which could be a hollow tree or a wall, or beekeepers try and collect swarms and they put them into a hive, so they've got a new colony. So if we get a call that there's a swarm somewhere, we inform beekeepers who are interested, and they go off and collect them, put them in a box, and they get a free bee colony that way. So the queen flies off with half the bees. The bees that are left in the hive... the hive has an entrance. The queen excluder only stops her from coming up. There's an entrance the other side. So, yeah. But she normally stays in the hive. But the bees that are left, they produce what's called queen cells, and they raise new queens. So it's their way of reproducing. The old queen has gone to set up a new colony. They create a new hive with a new queen. And this new queen has to go off and mate. And that's when the mating flights occur. After the new queens have hatched, they fly off and mate, and then they come back, and then they stay in the hive for the rest of their lives, basically, which could be 3 or 4 years sometimes. Very often they don't last that long, but they can last 3 or 4 years, the queens. Okay, that's a typical swarm collecting on a branch. It's sort of held together by pheromones, chemicals which the queen produces, which attracts the bees. There are other uses for these pheromones. If you collect the pheromone, I'm not quite sure how they do this, but you either collect it or make it, I think. You can smear it all over yourself and do that. Quite why you'd want to do it, I'm not sure. But no, they just use the pheromone. They use the chemical that the queen produces. It's a big thing in America. You get sort of competitions of bee beards, they call them. But they don't sting. They're obviously they've selected bees which are very calm anyway. But when bees are swarming, they very rarely sting. The times you get stung are when you get too close to a beehive, or you start taking the beehive apart. That's when you get stung. Right, what do bees feed on? Nectar, of course, which comes from flowers. What else do they feed on, do you think, apart from nectar? Pollen, yes, very good. Anything else? Water isn't quite so obvious, but they do need water, especially in this sort of weather. And something else they collect is resins from trees and things. Again, I'll show you what they do with them. So nectar they get from flowers, basically, and I'll come on to some of the main nectar sources. I've got a little video which... no, it's further on, sorry. Pollen, These are very large pollen grains. In fact, they're all over a bee. When a bee goes into a flower, it very often gets covered in pollen. But what you usually see is balls of pollen on their legs. You see that? And the pollen from different plants is different colours. This particular one, I think, is willow. They're collecting pollen from willow, so it's bright yellow. Again, you can't see this terribly well, but all sorts of different colours. Each cell contains a different type of pollen. Horse chestnut, for example, is a dark red. Bramble is a sort of greeny colour. You can get a chart here, which again you could come and have a look at, which has got all the different colours of pollen from different plants. So you can get a rough idea what your bees are feeding on from looking at this. Right, now my video. A bee goes to a flower, but within, well, it'll become clear in the video, within a few minutes, hundreds of other bees arrive at the same flower or group of flowers. So how on earth do they know? How do the bees in the beehive know where to go to find the honey? Well, this is a bit of scientific research which was done many years ago, and it's been repeated more recently.
A foraging honeybee will eventually discover a new food source, such as a freshly blooming flower or artificial feeder placed by a scientist. After this visit, an interesting thing happens. Over the next few minutes, many other bees arrive at the same location. They don't travel as a group. Instead, each bee finds the food source individually. How could these bees, who held no previous knowledge of this site, suddenly know precisely where the feeder was located? Is it possible that the animals communicate amongst themselves? To answer this question, Austrian biologist Carl von Frisch devised a series of experiments in the 1940s. Researchers at Georgia Tech have reproduced von Frisch's pioneering experiments using a modern observation hive. Two feeders are placed in different directions away from the hive. At each location, visiting honeybees are marked with a small spot of paint. A separate colour of paint is used at each station, so when a bee returns to the hive, it can easily be determined which feeding site it visited. Before von Frisch, other scientists had observed that returning bees tended to waggle about excitedly in a figure 8 pattern before sharing the collected pollen and nectar with their hive mates. While both sets of bees perform the classic figure 8 dance, the orientation of the dances is offset between the two groups. Bees returning from one feeder perform a rotated version of the dance done by the other bees. Incredibly, the angle of rotation precisely matches the angle between the feeding stations and the hive. This must be a clue to the mystery of how the bees are able to share information about the location of food. Through further experimentation, details of the grammar of the honeybees' dance language began to emerge. Their ability to see ultraviolet and polarized light allows them to determine the location of the sun at all times. Ultraviolet light is able to penetrate thick clouds or fog. Also, as light from the sun passes through the atmosphere, it's polarized in a direction towards the sun when viewed from the Earth. Devices like polarized film, sunglasses, or honeybee eyes can detect this orientation and determine the position of the sun even while looking in the opposite direction. This gives the bees a type of solar compass, allowing them to always know the precise position of the sun in the sky. In addition to this solar compass, bees possess a finely tuned internal clock. This clock is accurate enough for the bees to constantly estimate the new position of the sun as it travels across the sky. In this way, a honeybee can know the current orientation of the sun even after spending many hours within a dark hive. They can even take into account changes in seasons or latitudes. Inside of a dark vertically oriented beehive, the natural shared reference point is gravity. By pairing these two global constants, the bees form a simple language. Within the hive, the direction up, away from gravity, substitutes for the location of the sun. Then the angle that the bee dances compared to this up direction is the same angle a bee should fly away from the sun in order to find the target flower. So if the bee dances directly upward, other bees know that they can find flowers by flying directly towards the sun. If a bee dances 90 degrees to the left, then bees leaving the hive should fly 90 degrees to the left of the sun. A bee angling its dance towards the ground will let others know to fly directly away from the sun. As the day goes by, a bee will even use its internal clock to adjust for the movement of the sun in the sky. This lets fellow workers always know the correct direction to travel in order to find food.
Amazing. Yes, I hope you got that.
Do people only come out when it's sunny then? So if it's not sunny, do they stay in the house?
Not so much sunny, but if it's cold, if it's less than about 10 degrees, or if it's raining, no, they stay in. I noticed this morning, although it's pretty warm, it was a bit overcast, so the bees were, I think they got plenty of food at the moment, so they were staying in, but with this sun, they'll be out. I just thought I'd run through some of the more interesting plants that bees feed on. There are a huge range, as you probably know. Bees will feed on anything that produces nectar or pollen, basically, but they will naturally go for the most abundant source at that particular time. For example, this, I don't know if you know it, is called winter heliotrope, and it's one of these invasive species which there's been a lot of fuss about. It grows along road banks in particular. For example, if you go towards the tip near Tithixton, it's all along the roadside as you go into the tip. And it's a nuisance because it crowds out other native plants. It's a garden plant, basically. But the thing about it is it flowers in January and February, strong scent, and if it's a nice warm day, the bees will come out and feed on it. I don't think they get a lot out of it, but interesting anyway. Sort of going roughly through the year, one of the first plants that bees feed on is willow or pussy willow. Not much nectar, but plenty of pollen. And the pollen, as I'll come to explain later, is well, I should explain it now really. The pollen is the protein source for the bees. So the worker bees take the pollen back to the hive, they sort of chew it up, mix it with their saliva and with a bit of honey, and they feed it to the young grubs. So this is their main source of protein. The nectar is the source of energy, basically. So that's willow. Daffodils, again, when are we talking about? February, March. But some years they won't feed on dandelions at all. If the weather's suitable, if it's warm, when the daffodils are out, you will see them feeding on daffodils. Anybody know what that is? It's blackthorn, which is early March, April, that sort of time. And one of the first major sources of food for bees is blackthorn. A little bit later you get the hawthorn. Bees are not so keen on that. I find they will feed on it if there's nothing else, but they much prefer the blackthorn. Dandelion, of course, very abundant. Early spring you see the roadsides covered in dandelions, and then the council comes and chops them all down, unfortunately. But it's a very important source of nectar and pollen for the early bees. When they're feeding on dandelion, there's a sort of particular scent. When you open the hive up, you can smell this dandelion smell, and they stain everything a sort of bright yellow colour, so it's quite distinctive. Oilseed rape, love it or hate it, but it's a very good source of bees a source of honey for bees. There's quite a lot of it round here. I got some of my bees on fields near Tithixton, which had oilseed rape earlier in the year, and they did very well. They brought in about 150 pounds of honey in the space of a couple of weeks. That was 4 hives. So it can be a very useful source. It has some disadvantages. One is that the honey from it sets very quickly. It sets into a sort of pale white-coloured honey. Got some there, in fact. That's typical rape honey. But it's very nice honey. It's just that some people don't like set honey. They'd rather have the clear. I mean, you could clear this by putting it in the microwave, taking the lid off first. But it's perfectly nice honey. Horse chestnut, another good source. You might be surprised that, in fact, quite a few trees are important sources for bees. Gardeners will know this. It's a broad bean, but any of the bean family, peas, runner beans, French beans, or whatever, the bees get a lot of nectar from them, and it helps the gardener a lot. You'll find that if you've got honeybees in or close to your garden, you get a lot more peas in your pod or beans in your pod. That's borage, which you can cut the flowers off and put in your pims. But again, a good honey plant. You may not recognize this, but this is actually mint. I've got a bed of mint in the garden, and when it's in flower, which is about now, bees love it. In fact, any of that family, mint, thyme, sage, marjoram, there's a whole group of similar plants which are basically herbs, and the bees get a lot of honey from those. Apples or any fruit, apples, pears, black currants, red currants, all members of what we call the Rosaceae, the rose family, and they're all good for bees, but the bees are good for the plants because their pollination, particularly with fruits like apples, are dependent on bees and other insects. Again, I'm not sure if you can see that, but this is sycamore, which is all over the place. In sort of April time, you get these dangly white or greenish flowers. And again, if the weather's right, it's nice and warm when the flowers are out, you'll see trees buzzing with honeybees. You can plant, I've got some leaflets here which you can help yourselves to afterwards on what to plant for bees. A good one is this plant which is called Phacelia, Phacelia, Phacelia. It's used as what they call a green cover or a green manure. Farmers use it as well. It grows very quickly and then they plough it in. But if you leave it to flower, it flowers over quite a long period, and again, very rich source of nectar. That's blackberry, which is just about finishing now. Bees love that. They get a lot of honey from it. Marjoram, I mentioned earlier. It grows wild in the hedgerows around here, marjoram. It's the same plant as oregano, basically, that you get your herb from. I actually transplanted some into my garden and it's taken over. It grows very easily and it's a good honey plant. Well, you know what that is? It's a tree, obviously. It's lime, yes. Mostly planted in Parkland. There's some in Tithixton, some big lime trees. And again, they flower fairly late in about early July, and a very good nectar source. People noticed that you often found what appeared to be dying bees underneath the lime trees. So for a long time, people thought there was a poison in the nectar that was poisoning the bees, until some students did a simple experiment. What they did was they collected the nectar from these flowers and they fed it to these dying bees. Well, the dying bees immediately recovered and flew off back to their hives. So that wasn't the explanation. The explanation is quite different. What it is that bees are very efficient. When they fly from the hive to a source, they carry with them just enough energy in the form of nectar in their stomachs to get them to the source. And then they collect some more and fly back. Well, lime trees have a habit of suddenly stopping producing nectar if the weather changes. So what happens is the bees fly to the tree, there's no nectar, and they haven't got enough energy to get back, so they die, basically. But this doesn't happen too often, fortunately. Rosebay willow herb, another invasive plant, which is now everywhere. And some of you probably know this. I think it was brought into gardens in Victorian times, but it particularly likes to germinate on burnt soil. So after the Second World War in particular, it was established on bomb sites. It has also travelled along railways because as the steam trains went along, they caused fires on the banks of the railway, and rosebay willow herb came up in those places. Originally came from North America, so it's not strictly a native plant, but again, a good honey plant. And more of a garden plant, Cotoneaster. We've had calls from people saying we've got a swarm of bees in our garden. And when you get there, you find it's a Cotoneaster bush, and it's just hundreds of bees feeding on the flowers. Have any of you got I think it's called the Torbay palm in your gardens? It's a kind of palm tree with long dangling white flowers. There's a few of them around Porthcawl. That has the same sort of effect. You get huge numbers of bees on those when they're out. Heather, we haven't got much heather, well, except in gardens, but there's no sort of wild heather. But where there is heather, it's an important honey source for bees. It produces what they call a thixotropic honey, which is like a jellyish honey. So it's quite different from normal honey. And you need different type of equipment to get it out of the combs. But we don't have much around here. Again, some of you might know this. Anybody know what this is? It's all along the hedgerows, just beginning to come into flower now. It's Himalayan, it's not knotweed. No, it's Himalayan balsam. There are two major invasive plants. One is Japanese knotweed, which you see in great clumps in places, and it causes huge problems where it grows. In fact, Swansea Council actually has a knotweed officer whose whole job is to try and deal with Japanese knotweed. Japanese knotweed is quite a good honey plant, but this is even better. This is Himalayan balsam, which again is a non-native invasive plant. You'll see it as you go up the hill before you get to what we call Three-Step Hill. If you drive up past the Happy Valley campsite, on the right and the left, just about coming out now, there's banks of it. And it does take over many areas, particularly riverbanks. But it's one of our best honey plants. In fact, in some years, I would say that half of our honey crop comes from Himalayan balsam. So while the conservationists are trying to get rid of it, beekeepers have been known to spread it. Although I was told recently that they've actually added it to the list of prohibited plants. There are plants which you are not allowed to propagate, and I believe this is now one of them. It's not as bad as Japanese knotweed because it's an annual. There's no long roots like Japanese knotweed. You just pull it up and that's it. Something you might not think of particularly as a honey plant, but it is. This is ivy, which flowers from sort of September, October, November, flowers over quite a long period. And the honey that you get from it isn't very nice, basically. It's got a sort of chemically smell, but it's a very good source for the bees in the winter to build up their stores for the winter. What else do they need? They need water. for two reasons. One, in hot weather like this, they need to cool the hive, and they do this by taking water back to the hive and spreading it over the combs and fanning, creating a draft, and that way they cool the hive down. But also in the winter, when they're feeding on the stored honey, they have to dilute it. It's too concentrated for them to use, so they need water in the winter. If you've got a pond in your garden close to beehives, you might find lots of bees coming to your pond to feed. It can be a bit of a nuisance. This is a sort of sticky substance that the bees produce. I mentioned they collect resin mainly from trees, and they use it to stick everything together in the hive. It's called propolis. And in fact, some beekeepers collect it and sell it because it has medicinal properties. It's supposed to be good for sore throats. But the bees use it to seal any gaps. The name propolis comes from Greek, pro in front of, polis is city. So in wild colonies, what they often do is they build a kind of wall of propolis in front of the entrance to stop drafts, basically. So that's where the name propolis came from. If you get foreign bodies in the hive, you'll often find them covered in propolis. And this was in fact a mouse that had got into a hive, and presumably they stung it to death, and then they covered it with propolis. But it has antiseptic properties, so it'll sort of stop any infection coming out of that. What do bees make? Well, they make honey, obviously. And I've shown you one type of honey, that's oilseed rape honey. The type of the colour and so on of the honey depends entirely on what the bees are feeding on. So this is a clear honey, which is probably mainly from dandelion. Most honey in this country is what we call multifloral, so it comes from lots of different sources. The oilseed rape honey is a bit different because there's virtually nothing else in flower when that's out, but that will be multifloral, so there'll be maybe half a dozen different flowers contributing to that. A lot of these honeys start off clear, but most of them will set eventually. They'll crystallize. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just as good. In fact, some people prefer it set. But if you want it clear, you can always put it in the microwave for a minute, stir it around a bit, maybe another minute, and it will clear. But I wouldn't overdo the heating because you can destroy some of the properties of the honey, the enzymes and the various other chemicals that are in it can be destroyed by overheating. The other thing they produce is wax. They use the wax to make their honeycombs. It's quite expensive for the bees in that they use about 8 pounds of honey to make 1 pound of wax. So once they've built out those combs, they tend to keep using them as long as possible. That's a block of wax from this here's. This is simply actually it's the cappings. When I cut the cappings off these frames to extract the honey, I melt down the cappings and this produces this very nice beeswax. And there's some different honeys from different sources. Some of them are very dark, often from trees, they tend to be dark. What do you use the wax for? Well, you can make it into candles, or you can make it into polish or lotions. Some people return it to the manufacturers who make this foundation, and they get sheets of foundation back in return. So it's like an exchange system. Right, why do I keep bees? Well, there's a whole host of reasons. It's a very interesting hobby. Before I retired, I thought I need something to do when I retire. And I was always interested in wildlife and animals and so on. So I thought, what about bees? So I did a course, couple of years before I retired, a beekeeping course. It's a fascinating hobby. You learn an awful lot. You learn about wildlife because you need to know about the plants. You need to know about the other insects, the bumblebees and the wasps and so on. Have you heard of the Asian hornet? This is the latest threat to honeybees. It's slightly smaller than the native British hornet, but it specifically goes for beehives. What they do is the Asian hornets, they sort of go backwards and forwards in front of the hive, and they actually catch honeybees coming out and eat them. And they can destroy a hive if there's enough of them. So it's spread from, I think it came from Asia originally. It spread across Europe. It's now in France. A couple have been seen in Britain. There was a nest found last year in Devon, but it was destroyed. One was seen this year on a cauliflower, imported from Holland, I believe. So how it got there, we don't know. But we don't think that has created a nest, touch wood. So we're on the lookout for the Asian hornet. It keeps me active. You need things to keep your mind and body active, I think. There's an awful lot to learn. I went on a beekeeping course, but I'm still learning. And you can take exams in beekeeping as well, which I've done a few of. And it can be a social activity. I'm involved in the local Beekeepers Association, and we get together at least once a month and talk about bees, which some people find very boring. But and there's a bit of income. I've got 12 hives at the moment. I might make a few £100 when I've taken all the expenses into consideration. But if you want to make a proper income, you need hundreds or thousands of hives. But you can cover your costs and make a few bob. And you get honey, of course. And, if you're not interested in selling it, you can give it to friends and neighbours and family. If you are interested in keeping bees, there are certain things you need. You need somewhere to keep bees, a large garden. Some people have tried keeping bees on housing estates in small gardens. You can get away with it if you're lucky, but at some point you'll get a colony which is, we say defensive, which means aggressive, basically. And when you get a colony like that, your neighbours get stung and it causes problems. So you'll very often find people give up when they're in that situation. But you don't necessarily need a large garden. You just need to find a farmer or somebody with an orchard or a bit of land, and they're often very glad to have the bees. So, if you ask around, you can find sites, which is often better than keeping them at home. You need to be reasonably fit. It's the boxes of honey are quite heavy, and you have to lift them off and sort them out and carry them to your car or whatever. So reasonable level of fitness. And it helps if you have practical skills. A little bit of carpentry helps in repairing or making things, making up frames, repairing boxes and so on. Persistence. Very often people give up after their first year because their bees die or something goes wrong. But if you persist, you can get on top of things, and eventually it begins to work out. So it's not an easy hobby. It's something you have to work at. And you need, time. I just thought I'd give you an idea. If you've got 1 or 2 hives, during the summer you would need to look at them sort of every week. Maybe a couple of hours a week, something like that. And then in the winter, maybe once every month you'd need to have a look. The more hives you've got, the longer it takes. I mean, it takes me a couple of days a week, something like that. Maybe not a full day, but a couple of days a week to look after the bees. In the winter, it's much easier. We just look at them every month or so. And very important, training. Again, quite a few people have bought a hive from somewhere, At the end of the year, they're all dead, and that's the end of it. They give up because they don't know what they're doing, basically. It is quite a complicated business, and you really need to get some training. Like a lot of things, there's a lot of stuff online, and you can learn quite a bit online, but there's no substitute for sort of going with somebody who's been doing it for years. Just to give you a rough idea, if you were to buy a couple of hives, a bee suit, all the other bits and pieces, probably come to about £500 or so. So you need a little bit of cash to start with. While we're on that, I just thought I'd show you a couple of basic bits of equipment. This is a bee suit, which gives you full protection. There's a hood there as well, so you're completely protected against bees. Having said that, in this weather, it gets very, very hot in a bee suit, so I often wear a t-shirt. Well, unfortunately, the bees are able to sting through this fabric. So if they're really angry, they will sting you on your arms, but they don't get the sting fully in, so it's not too bad usually. If you keep bees, you will get stung, and it inevitably, and it hurts, but the more you get stung generally, the less it hurts. Unfortunately, a few people are allergic, so obviously after a couple of stings, if you get a really severe reaction, then unfortunately you probably shouldn't keep bees. All beekeepers have a smoker, which you fill with corrugated cardboard or sacking, and you light it and you blow it into the hive. It calms the bees down. They think there's a fire, forest fire maybe, and they go into the hive and they fill themselves full of honey, which sort of calms them a bit. And you can also use it to move them around because it drives them away. You might wonder what on earth the grass is. Well, when you've finished with the smoker, you lay it on its back and you stuff something into the thing and it goes out. If you didn't do that, it would carry on smoking. Gloves, leather gloves these are. Some people use plastic gloves with long gauntlets as well to protect. They particularly like going for your wrists, so this covers any gaps between the glove and the wrist. And you need a hive tool because bees have a tendency to stick everything together. So the hive tool is just like a strong steel lever for getting everything apart. Right. I'll just say a little bit about Bridgend Beekeepers because I'm a trustee and the education officer for the association. It's a friendly local group, we've got 120 odd members. We meet in Coitrehen Community Hall once a month for talks, but we run an annual beginners course which starts at the beginning of April, which is combined theory and practical. And we have weekly, apart from the beginners course, we also have weekly meetings during the summer. Our apiary is in Bringaroo Country Park. Do you know the garden centre called Bee Leaf? Right at the top of Bringaroo Country Park, we've got an apiary sort of just down the slope from Bee Leaf. As well as the talks and so on, we also have a shop where you can buy equipment at reduced rates. And you've got insurance, which you need. If somebody gets stung, you'd be covered for any liability there as well, if you're a member of the association. And this is a group of beginners from last year up at our apiary. Those suits, we can lend those out to the beginners so they don't have to buy their suits until they decide to keep bees themselves. As I said, I've got some leaflets here which you can have a look at. You're welcome to have a look at the hives. Right, so are there any questions? Yeah.
What's the farthest they can fly?
They reckon about 5 miles, something like that, in any direction.
So 5 miles there and back.
Well, 5 miles out and 5 miles back, yeah. They'd much rather go for something nearer, obviously, but they can.
If I see bees on the lawn, or I'm cutting the lawn, and they're lethargic, I would say, rather than anything else, does it mean they're dying?
It could be. I mean, the bumblebees in particular, they run out of energy. And there are people that suggest you can put a little bit of honey out for them. I don't know whether that does the trick. Thinking of bees in the lawn, we get calls from people who've got mining bees. You're not thinking of mining bees. They make little holes in the ground. They're solitary bees. They haven't got a colony like a honeybee. And you'll see these little sort of volcanoes of sand, and that's where the mining bees have come out.
Is
Greg,
Sorry, Gwen.
Is there still a market for queen?
Yes, yeah. Yes, it's quite complicated, but yes, you can buy queens. You buy the queen with a few workers in a little box and you introduce it to your hive. Yeah, so there's a big market.
She passes her characteristics.
Yes,
And that's
yeah.
what you're after, of course.
Yeah. And a lot of commercial beekeepers, they replace their queens every year. I don't do that, but yeah, they kill off the old queens and just replace them with bought-in queens.
So leading on from that,
Yeah.
the queen, there's so few it appears. I mean, is there some natural answer as to why there's just, are there many queen bees?
Well, there's one per colony.
Well, right, but are there not many bees that are in turn that are propagated?
Well, that's the natural way of reproducing. There's one queen per colony. When they split, they produce another queen. I'm not quite clear what you mean. The queens are not independent of the colony.
Yeah, that's probably the answer.
Yeah.
It's probably a simple answer, but I just don't grasp it sort of bit. Yes.
Well, the queen is part of the colony. There can't be a colony without a queen. There can't be a queen without a colony.
And as that breaks up, they will produce one more queen.
Yeah.
They can never produce two queens.
Well, occasionally, but normally it's just one queen. But so there's always a queen with a colony, and there aren't more than one queen now.
Great wonders of nature.
Yeah.
And just one other question. When, for example, looking at blackberry, if you see the blackberry, so you see the bees on there, they serve both purpose then. They both arrive there and take their nectar away and in the pollen, and in turn they determine what, in part, the success of the blackberry bush for the autumn to come.
Yeah, that's right. It's what's called co-evolution, isn't it? The plants and the insects evolve together, so they suit each other basically. Yeah.
Do you remember that very, very expensive cosmetic product called royal jelly?
Yes. Royal jelly, when the bees decide to make a new queen, they make a particularly large cell and they produce with their glands and so on a very rich, protein-rich food, and it's called royal jelly, and that's what they feed the queen. So the egg that the queen starts off is the same as a worker egg, but the reason she becomes a queen is because of the diet that she gets, which is royal jelly. Some beekeepers, I don't know how they do it, but they collect the royal jelly from these queen cells. They must have a way of making the bees produce hundreds of queen cells, and then they must destroy them all, which, I don't know, it's not something I would do. But, yeah.
What's the difference in wasp and bee?
Well, wasps are closely related to bees. They're similar in some ways. They form a small colony, but the difference is bees will go through the winter as a colony, as a group of bees with a queen. With wasps, they die off at the end of the summer, and the only thing that survives are a few queens which go into sheds and other places and hibernate. There's lots of differences. One is that the wasps make their nests out of wood, basically. You can see them scraping wood off fences and things, and it looks like paper. If you've ever seen a wasp's nest, it's like a paper ball. Obviously, honeybees is wax that they make everything from. Oh, another difference is that wasps can sting you more than once. Bees can only sting you once because they die. The sting is pulled out.
How do they tolerate the temperatures? Because we've had this hot weather and of course we have the snow.
Yeah. The snow in the winter, they produce a small ball, which they hardly move. They just move around as a ball. And they keep themselves warm by moving their wing muscles and so on. The better the hive is insulated, the better they survive. I put polystyrene boxes over my hives in the winter, but they will survive very cold weather by just not moving, basically. In the summer, they fan air and they use water to cool the hives, but they don't mind this hot weather. They thrive on it, I think. They do very well. I think honeybees didn't really originate in places like Britain. They originated in hotter countries. The native British bee is fairly well adapted to our climate, but they definitely do better in hotter countries.
A few years ago, there was a very serious threat, wasn't there, was it a disease or...
I think you're thinking of the varroa mite.
That's the one.
It's a tiny little mite, or well, you can see it. It's a tiny little brown spider-like creature, and it lives on the bee and it sucks the bee's blood, weakens them. But the main thing is it spreads viruses, which can kill colonies. We can treat against varroa using various chemicals, and we treat against them every year. But we have noticed that in recent years, the numbers of varroa are going down, and we think that the bees are developing resistance to varroa, fortunately. But it has been a major problem. Yeah.
Was there also threat from black bees?
Well, you're thinking of black. Well, this black bees are the native British bees. Is that what you're thinking of? I said there's only one species, Apis mellifera, but there are different strains, like subspecies, and the one that's native to Britain is called Apis mellifera, and it's sometimes called the British black bee. And there are some beekeepers who are trying to restore this native bee. The problem is that for hundreds of years, people have imported bees from all over Europe, particularly from Italy and other places. And those bees are slightly different. They all interbreed. But to try and get back to the native British bee is quite difficult because the genes from all these other strains are all over the place. Yeah, sure.
Specific bee that visits one specific plant in my garden. It's got this brilliant orange tail.
Oh, yeah.
It doesn't go anywhere. So I got a picture of what I think he is here.
Right.
But why just one?
It sounds like a bumblebee if it's got an orange tail.
Really, really rusty orange.
Yes, that's there are about a dozen species of bumblebees. So it'll be that one species. I wouldn't say it would be one bee, but certainly...
I've only ever seen him on this particular...
Yeah, but it's probably the same bees, a number of bees from the same colony, I should think, visiting the flower.
Can I just ask the last question? In my garden at home, it's nice to have the bees. Is there anything that I shouldn't do, insecticides or anything, you say, oh, that's a no-no?
Yeah, definitely. Again, you might have heard of neonicotinoids, which, well, farmers have been using these new chemicals called neonicotinoids, which are based on nicotine, basically. Farmers used to, gardeners, I've heard of gardeners chewing tobacco and spitting on the stems of the broad beans to kill the aphids. So it's a chemical similar to nicotine, but it's artificially produced. They've been using these for years because they're very effective insecticides, but they do affect bees. And those chemicals have now been banned for farming use, but they are still on sale in garden centres for amateur gardeners. So all I would say is have a look at what's look at the ingredients. If it's clothianidin or similar name, then it's a neonicotinoid. But the trouble is you'd need to look it up really. So that's something you can do. But avoid the use of any chemicals if you can, basically. And the other thing is to plant suitable plants for bees. Yeah.
Could you repeat where one meets and the time for a visit to Porthcawl?
Yes, I thought we'd meet at 2 o'clock at Park Slip if you want to lift. Oops. If you want to lift. But if you don't, do you know where Park Slip is? We'll meet at 2 o'clock at the rugby club then. Okay.
Are there any other questions?
Can I just ask? There's been a thing going on Facebook to say give us a spoonful of sugared water out for the bees.
Yeah.
Hot weather.
Might do some good, but I think probably just water rather than... You'd have to be careful not to make it too strong or anything, but it might help a bit, but probably just a bit of water in this weather.
Are there any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Greg. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm not quite sure about the more you get stung, the less it hurts. Don't quite know how that one works. What about you? You gave us a lovely list of the plants and flowers which bees like. What about sort of proper sort of garden plants? Roses and what have you. Are they any good?
Yes, I mean it depends on the plant. There's a leaflet here which covers hundreds of plants. Basically, from simple things, anything that produces nectar. Don't go for double flowers. Simple flowers, not double complicated ones, because the bees can't get at the nectar. On here it's got winter hellebore, mahonia, cowslip, rosemary. There's a list of hundreds of plants there. So take one of these or look it up on the internet.
Okay, thank you, Greg. So as I said, that was absolutely fascinating. I didn't know half of this about the reason how they communicate is very good, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's absolutely fascinating. I didn't know that. Well, thank you very much, Greg.
Okay.
Could we show our appreciation in the usual way?